Jai Hind and welcome back, children. Let us start with the class today. The chapter which I'll take up today is A Triumph of Surgery by James Herriot. Now, as I have given the introduction, the chapter is all about Tricky, a small dog. It was excessively loved by his mistress, Mrs. Pumphrey. Tricky was a greedy dog, children, who loved food but did not go for any exercise. As a result, he became fat. Mrs. Pumphrey, on the other hand, believed that he became lazy due to suffering from malnutrition. Let us go through the chapter and know more about the mistress and the dog. What was the triumph of surgery, children? Now, James Herriot treated the dog without medicine of surgery. The story, A Triumph of Surgery, revolves around an ill dog named Tricky and his mistress, Mrs. Pumphrey. The dog was hugely fat. His eyes were blood red and rheumy. James Herriot was a vet surgeon. He had many good experiences of curing pet dogs and cats. He has given a very interesting and touching expression of his experiences. In this lesson, he has given the description of a dog's disease. Mrs. Pumphrey's dog Tricky was seriously ill. James Herriot treated the dog without medicine of surgery. Now, let us know something about the author. James Alfred Witt Herriot was an English veterinary surgeon. You know who is a veterinary surgeon? The doctors who treats the animals. Yes. And a writer. He was a surgeon, veterinary surgeon and a writer. He was born on 3rd October 1916 in Sunderland, England. James Herriot was his pen name. Being a noted veterinary surgeon, he utilized his vast experience in writing stories about animals. How interesting is this? He wrote a series of books of stories about animals and their masters. James Alfred Witt, named as James Herriot, died on 23rd February 1995 at the age of 78. Now, we have known the author. Now, each chapter, as I tell you, children, it has a moral, it has a message in it, and the author wants us to learn those morals, learn those messages. Why? Those messages would help to give a shape to our inner soul. All right. The moral of the chapter is that anything, even food, if given more than it is required, will harm the body. But if in time you come into proper routine, that problem can be resolved without any surgery. The moral of the lesson is that one shouldn't use the resources much. Did you learn anything? Now let us come to the theme of the story. The story, A Triumph of Surgery, revolves around an ill dog named Tricky and his mistress, Mrs. Pumphrey. The dog was hugely fat. His eyes were blood red and rheumy. Mrs. Pamphray gave her malt, cod liver oil, and bowl of Horlicks. Yummy, isn't it? Still, Tricky had no energy. The doctor advised her to cut down on sweet things. Tricky left eating and kept vomiting. It used to eat and used to vomit. He was to be hospitalized. The doctor gave Tricky nothing to eat for the first 2 days except water. On the third day, there were signs of improvement. He started taking food properly. The doctor didn't give him any medical treatment, children. Tricky used to run around and play with the other dogs cheerfully. Soon he recovered completely. Mrs. Pamphray continued inquiring about Tricky on the phone. When she came to collect the dog, tears were shining in her eyes. She called this magical recovery, a triumph of surgery. Now, this is the theme. We have learned about the author. Now, what are the characters in the short story? First, we'll know about the doctor, James Herriot, who is the author also. James is a veterinary surgeon who proves to be a capable doctor and a wise individual. He is an animal lover and a caring guardian. Now, character sketch of Mrs. Pamphray. She is a wealthy single woman. She is very much attached to her dog Tricky. She is very loving but weak at heart. Now, the character sketch of Tricky. Tricky is a lazy and a fat dog who loves food. He is very fond of his owner. He turns out to be energetic and lively after recovering from his illness. Children, when you eat much, you stop working also. Now let us come to the summary of the chapter. Listen very carefully. The story starts when Mrs. Pamphray, a rich lady, takes her dog out for a walk. A nearby veterinary doctor who knows the lady sees the dog and is shocked as he sees that the dog looks like a blotted sausage with a leg at each end. What is a sausage, children? It is a fast food which is made out of minced meat. It is cylindrical in shape. So the dog looked just like a cylinder having 4 legs at each end. He advises her to stop giving him unhealthy things to eat. But Mrs. Pamphray is not able to refuse him. Soon he falls sick and the doctor is called. Who is this he, children? Tricky the dog. Yes. The narrator, Mr. Herriot, then somehow takes Tricky the dog to the hospital, even though he knows that Mrs. Pamphray is not ready to leave her dog and nearly fainted just by hearing these words. Which words? That he will be taken to the hospital, that Mrs. Pamphray will be departing from, they won't stay together for some days. Hearing this, she started fainting. Then he takes the dog along and puts a bed for him in his surgery. The dog doesn't move much nor eats anything for the first 2 days because it was so lethargic. On the second day, he looks around and whimpers a bit. He wanted to go out on the third day and started playing with bigger dogs when he was taken out. He also licked the bowels of the other dogs clean on the third day. Now, so it was getting normal. Then his condition started improving very fast. He started fighting for his meals with other dogs. Then when this news reached Mrs. Pamphret, she started sending him eggs as he thought that Tricky was recovering from an illness and needed energy. So she supplied foods. Mr. Harriet and his partners started eating those eggs from the morning for the morning breakfast. They did not give those eggs to Tricky. Then for improving Tricky's blood, Mrs. Pamphret started sending in bottles of wine, which was again consumed by Mr. Harriet. He used to take 2 glasses before lunch and some more glasses while having the lunch. Then when she started sending in bottles of brandy for Tricky, that was the time when Mr. Harriet thought that he would really like to keep Tricky as a permanent guest in the surgery. Did you follow, children? Now, so the doctor did not give anything to the dog. Mr. Harriet used to be really happy someday by having 2 extra eggs every morning, then having few glasses of wine in the afternoon, and closing the day by having brandy at night. So he was having a great time, children. But then he took a wise decision and called up Mrs. Pamphret, as she was really worried, and on this side Tricky was ready to be taken back home. Tricky was really happy to see his mistress and jumped into the car. This is the way your dogs, your pets also jump over you, na? When you return back from school, isn't it? Mrs. Pamphret said that she won't be able to ever thank him, means the doctor, for what he had done, and also that his surgery had been successful, as Tricky was now cured. So did you understand the story? Did you like the story? Yes. Now you have the word meanings, children. Go through the word meanings very minutely, and not only going through it, you have to learn the words, you have to learn the meanings, and you have to use these words in your write-ups, in your answers. Alright, the words are blotted, sausage, roomy, then malt, then hastened, then relent, then lumbago. Alright, you have to learn all these words. Pause the video, learn the word meanings. Alright, because you're not having your books right now. In your books the word meanings are there, but as you're not having your word meanings there, so I have provided the word meanings here in the video. Pause your video, learn the word meanings, children. The other words are regime, then distraught, vouch, tottering, soothe, pine. Again pause the page, go through the word meanings, learn the words, learn the meanings properly so that you can use in your write-ups, children. The main intention is to learn the words. Then the word meanings of your next page, they're supper, despairing, gasping, sniffing, whimper, engulfed, slopped. Same instruction will be followed for this page also. Pause the video, learn the words. The words in the next page, page 4, is jostling, scrimmages, shoggy, convalesce, chauffeur, then triumph. So you would be following the instructions. I know my students will be following the instructions as I have asked you to. Coming to the end, what do? We sum up the chapter. So here we'll start doing it. So the first is, James Harriet stops his car and sees the poor health of Mrs. Pamphre's dog, Tricky. He advises Mrs. Pamphre to put Tricky on a strict diet and make him exercise daily. Mrs. Pamphre continues to overfeed Tricky, which worsens his condition. She calls Harriet for helping on noticing Tricky's deteriorating health. Harriet decides to hospitalize Tricky for a fortnight to treat him. Tricky's hospitalization left Mrs. Pamphre and the helpers at home in tears because they loved Tricky so much. Tricky was kept on a strict diet in the hospital. His diet was increased according to the improvements he showed. Mrs. Pamphre's anxiousness about Tricky's health went away on learning that Tricky was convalescing satisfactorily. She started to send eggs, wine, and brandy for Tricky to enrich his blood and improve his health. These items were instead enjoyed by James Harriet and his partner. Tricky was transformed from a weak, fat dog to a hard, muscled, and agile one. James Harriet calls Mrs. Pamphre to come and take Tricky back home. That's the end of our chapter. I hope everybody have understood, enjoyed this short story, and learned one thing, that too much of anything is always injurious to health. Alright, now children, I'll be sharing the PDF of the extra questions. Please, you will be going through the extra questions, learn these extra questions, and you will add up those extra questions in your question bank, which you will need at the end of the session before your board exams. Thank you. Jai Hind.